Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. The British-born architect, interior decorator, and furniture designer Terence Harold Robsjohn-Gibbings was one of the most in-demand stylists of the 1940s. Known for his Grecian-inspired furniture, Robsjohn-Gibbings worked for society clients, including the publisher Alfred A. Knopf and the tobacco heiress Doris Duke. His most high-profile commission was from the attempted socialite Hilda Weber, for whom he created the most infamous work, his collection of furniture for the record-setting Hollywood mansion Casa Encantada. During the post-war period, he pivoted to mass-market furniture in a mid-century inspired aesthetic, designing pieces that, while modern in form, provided warmth and texture through their materiality. In the 1960s, Robsjohn-Gibbings moved to Athens, Greece, and launched a line of furniture in association with design firm Saritas of Athens. He concluded his career working for select clients, including Aristotle Onassis. In addition to his design work, Robsjohn-Gibbings was also a polemicist, writing 4 books and numerous articles. While Robsjohn-Gibbings is primarily known for his furniture, these efforts were successful as well. He had an astute understanding of media that he used to both advertise and argue, often vituperously. This paper looks at his 4 books to reveal a surprising aspect of Robsjohn-Gibbings, his role as a champion of the organic movement in American architecture. Beginning with his first book, Goodbye, Mr. Chippendale, Robsjohn-Gibbings mounted a spirited, humorous, and dramatic literary campaign in the names of Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright and the organic movement. The organic movement was an aesthetic philosophy established by American writers and artists such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Horatio Greenough, and the painters of the Hudson School. This movement called for American artists to reinvent culture for their continent, developing a new canon that expressing a democratic and free American character. This canon was to be based on a study of nature, which would be a sufficient source of inspiration on its own as to render others unnecessary. In architecture, this philosophy was realized by 4 practitioners: Leopold Eidlitz, Frank Furness, Louis Sullivan, and Frank Lloyd Wright. Eidlitz, born in Bohemia and educated in Vienna, brought German idealism to America both in design and writing. Furness, son of the Unitarian minister William Henry Furness, a lifelong friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman, was present for the founding of organicism. This sensibility was then imparted on Louis Sullivan, who apprenticed at Furness' office in 1873. He acknowledged Furness's impact in his autobiography of an idea and developed his own theory of natural design in his system of architectural ornament. Finally, and most famously, Frank Lloyd Wright made a brand out of organic architecture, notably promulgated in a lecture series at the RIBA in May 1939. In his opening lines, his role as Sullivan's apprentice is also in turn acknowledged. Beyond the podium, Wright was also aware of his own connection to the 19th century. He referenced Greenough in an inscription in his Oak Park drafting room. From the outset, Robsjohn-Gibbings was clear about his project. Goodbye, Mr. Chippendale opens with a quote of Goethe's exhorting the continent of America to take advantage of its lack of history to design for itself a new world. He then begins his argument by establishing how the design tastes of England were formed on the Grand Tour. The Grand Tours are described as not actually creating homes. Instead, they were creating, quote, halls and salons with which to display their carefully trained manners, end quote. Next, the great furniture makers of the age are indicted for their lack of artistic integrity in supplying these salons. Advertisements are shown that highlight the availability of a grab bag of orientally themed rooms. Chippendale, Sheraton, and others were not engaged in design. They were taking advantage of the latest trends in palatial puffery. A class angle then arose due to the industrial tycoons who overtook the financial and political, but not social position of the aristocrats in the Victorian age. To respond to the priority, the tycoons began acquiring the land, titles, and furniture of the gentry they wanted to replace. To facilitate these acquisitions, a new businessman emerged, the antiques dealer. This class envy was not only the province of millionaires. The newly forged middle classes wanted in as well, but as there were not enough authentic pieces to go around, a forgery industry was established to cater for them. This created a situation where the design of original furniture was not profitable. This mania for antiques was then imported to America, facilitated by the arrival of the English tastemakers and promoted by the World's Columbian Exposition in 1896. This taste-making regime was then codified by the decorator Elsie de Wolfe, who through her writings promulgated a trend for Americans to join their British cousins in acquiring antiques, a situation only too welcomed by dealers looking for new markets. The design results of this succession are then ridiculed. The publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst's mansion at San Simeon is mocked as a glorified warehouse, and the cartoonist Mary Petty illustrates this with an image of a gilded sedan chair adapted into a phone booth. Robsjohn-Gibbings then turns his attention to architecture. Repeating his modus operandi, he levels his attacks first at customers, then practitioners. The American 19th century nouveau riche, enamored of the Europe they were visiting on vacations, wanted to bring back an architecture that was already out of date by the time they arrived. McKim, Mead, and White then get accused of the same sins that Hearst committed, as exemplified by the Whitney Mansion of 1883. Quote, "The entrance hall looked like a combination of Wanamaker's department store and the lower level of Grand Central Station. There were tapestries lapping at the stone stairs, tapestries draped as portieres, and tapestries cut up as pillows on the red velvet sofas. It was as though one had bought Versailles from a dry goods store by the bolt and draped it from floor to ceiling." Robsjohn-Gibbings sums up the previous 50 years of American decorating and design as a collective class-based delusion of the nouveau riche, who threw away 50 years of potential in favor of, quote, "turning the houses into the rubbish dumps of Europe," end quote. He then presents the alternative, Frank Lloyd Wright. While he does not use the term organic, it is the spirit of organic architecture that he is describing. A reference to the May 1939 Reba lectures is hard to ignore. The book ends with Robsjohn-Gibbings imploring the house buyers of the furniture to reject the piled-up detritus of old Europe and get to know contemporary architecture. However, for his next literary endeavor, Robsjohn-Gibbings took on a different and surprising foe. Mona Lisa's Mustache, a dissection of modern art, retains the same witty and waspish tone that Goodbye, Mr. Chippendale brought to it there, but chose as a significantly more countercultural target. The entire movement of modern art and design from the pre-Raphaelites down through Salvador Dali. The central thesis of Mona Lisa's Mustache is that there is a common thread that binds the entire movement together: magic. Magic, as explained by Robsjohn-Gibbings, was the pre-scientific age methodology of establishing the power of an elite, the magicians, upon a populace using distorted images of life. The display of these images, appropriately framed in New Age spiritualism, as taught by the occultist Madame Blavatsky, provides a platform from which the magicians can influence the masses and enjoy the benefits of an exalted status in their societies. Robsjohn-Gibbings starts by explaining how, inspired by the writings of Ruskin and other medieval romanticizers, the pre-Raphaelites sought to strike back against the scientific and bourgeois Victorian age, which had demolished the old medieval order of elite patrons that they wished to both serve and be elevated by, using Celtic sources as well as technical forms to hide a lack of skill. He then makes the case that this magic strategy of mining pre-scientific age societies and their art for inspiration and forms, creating, quote, original works from these sources, and selling that to the public as a true and spiritual art comprehensible to the enlightened, well disguising a dearth of talent, was used by Gauguin, Picasso, Kandinsky, and the Surrealists, to name but a few. He also holds that magic was adapted for use by individuals outside the art world, most notably in politics by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, first to advance futurism, then fascism. Robsjohn-Gibbings is at pains to make clear that these efforts were not just self-aggrandizement. They stem from a hunger of power on the part of the magicians, both artists and politicians alike. The chapter on the architecture indicts the Deutsche Werkbund, whose goal of becoming, quote, the organ of cultural consciousness of the nation, end quote, along with the strict control of their own membership, is characterized as an attempt to do the cultural thinking of the German people for them. For Robsjohn-Gibbings, the attitude he saw in the European avant-garde was as elitist as antithetical to the democratic spirit of the architecture he champions as the antiques were before them. Mona Lisa's Mustache concludes by considering modern motion's attempt to cross over to America, highlighting how poorly the work of the Cubists and Futurists was received by the archaeologically educated, like Theodore Roosevelt, as well as the general American public. However, the monster managed to rear its ugly head in New York City in the form of the MoMA. A brief and dismissive history of MoMA exhibitions is put forth. The section covering the International Style exhibit gives Robsjohn-Gibbings an opportunity to juxtapose Frank Lloyd Wright's rejoinder to Corbusier's "the house is a machine for living" dictum, only insofar as the heart of a man is a suction pump. Robsjohn-Gibbings continues this argument by explicitly contrasting modernism with the organic movement in his third book, Homes of the Brave. Homes of the Brave begins by discussing the 100-year quest for an indigenous American house. Center stage is the organic movement, beginning with the sculptor and theorist Horatio Greenaw's 1856 call for form to follow function in buildings, just as it had in nature. The rest of the book enumerates characters, movements, and their effect on the American home's evolution in the 20th century, presenting them in either a hagiographical or damning light. The first chapter, Organic Architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright, falls squarely into the former category. Born of the pressures of the new century, the rushing wind of change swept through the homes of America, whistling in Italian cupolas, knocking down Japanese fans, blowing the dust from Turkish hangings. Great architecture comes only with individual greatness. On hand was Frank Lloyd Wright. There are some concessions to earlier achievements. Robsjohn-Gibbings credits 19th century homes' lofty rooms and sprawling porches with providing deeper virtues that overcome the European pastiches that define their forms. However, that past is quickly thrown aside as a valuable source of architectural information in favor of a more universal one, nature itself. Wright is quoted extensively to elaborate on the connections of his architecture to nature. Thoughts on how to integrate landscape, animals, and even foodstuffs are all synthesized by Wright into a, quote, organic unity of form and material. The next chapter, the Art Nouveau, presents a dark mirror to our hero. Henry van de Velde is introduced as Wright's opposite number. They both, quote, faced the new century and the new industrial age, end quote. However, Van de Velde is held to have offered, instead of freedom, the dictatorship of a style. The Industrial Revolution is the source of a middle class that is resented by Van de Velde for the temerity of indulging in eclecticism. His response is to divide the population into a sentimental pre-modern man and the efficient modern man. The modern man needs a modern environment, hence the development of a modern architectural style, the Art Nouveau. However, Van de Velde's plans were spoiled by the bourgeois public, appropriating Art Nouveau for its own ends. Through its proliferation as the style of choice for high-end restaurants, Louis Tiffany's line of lamps, and other upscale uses, Art Nouveau merely became another flavor of the eclecticism it was supposed to defeat. The book then proceeds chapter by chapter and chronologically through various movements in design and architecture. The Californian architects, Green and Green, are held up as unsung allies of Wright in the quest for an indigenous American home and are extolled for both their unassuming originality and elegant combination of influences. The development of Art Deco, in contrast, is characterized as a rebranding of the decorative French luxuries of the past. The new man returns to be housed in the modernismus of Germany, the product of an aggressive Prussian militarist determined to excise the shame of the First World War through a stark new architecture shorn of the shame of the past. Robsjohn-Gibbings' most aggressive chapter is Machine for Living Modern, an assessment of the work of Le Corbusier and his followers. He opens by asserting that to reflect the machines they're meant to be emulating, individuality is stripped from the design of the houses. He then proposes a motivation for the architect and client in seeking out this house. A shared belief in functionalism, the idea that all problems can be solved via logical spatial arrangements. This functionalism is fashionable because it is new, but also because it makes his houses honest. In earlier times, clients that wanted anachronisms were simply old-fashioned. However, to deviate from what is prescribed by the modern architect now is to make an architecture that lies. If a design element is not functional, then it is dishonest architecture. This reduction of the role of the client is emphasized in how he is characterized upon taking delivery of the home. He must wait for photographers to finish capturing the building's angles at exactly the right times, and then accommodate crowds of intelligentsia who've come to expect the modern man in his modern house. This is a building by and for the architect, not the homeowner, a fact emphasized by how the modern home is not, according to Robsjohn-Gibbings, a pleasant place to live. Rackets echo through the open plans, and central hearths with ceiling-mounted flues smoke residents like herrings. Robsjohn-Gibbings has no patience for architecture that he perceives as not being for the people who use it. The book then meanders through a few more iterations of modern. Amusingly, Dome, Sweet Dome discusses Buckminster Fuller, and Interplanetary Modern reviews comic book architecture. Robsjohn-Gibbings wraps up with the complaint that the designers of his time had been dedicating their energy to escaping the past, just as the generations before them were governed by it, resulting in an anonymous and inhuman environment. His closing statement on how there are homes being built that are enriched and forwarded by the spirit of the past, that express their individuality in the fullest terms, goes unqualified. Unfortunately, Robsjohn-Gibbings was retreading ground. Sullivan and Wright themselves had attempted to call for a popular organic movement. Growing out of a draftsmen's organization called the Chicago Architecture Club, founded in 1885, their movement first backed the arts and crafts movement before pivoting to support of the prairie style, holding two exhibitions that prominently featured Wright in 1901 and 1902. However, the movement died. Wright left no successor the way Sullivan had and Furness before him. Organic architecture, at least as a public idea, had come and gone already. What was Robsjohn-Gibbings to do? In both his professional and intellectual life, he retreated to Greece. His final book, Furniture of Classical Greece, written with his partner Carlton W. Pullen, is a shift in tone, opening with his discovery of the furniture painted on classical Greek vases in the British Museum. He then describes how, animated with excitement at the elegance of the pieces, he spent first weekends and then vacations tracking down every artifact he could find. After a move back to New York, Robsjohn-Gibbings then recounts how he recreated a classical Greek salon on Madison Avenue as a showroom from which to sell a line of 6 pieces sourced from his studies. Opening in 1937, his pieces were meant to, quote, capture the spirit that made them timeless. However, World War II ended his business and prompted his move to mass market design. It is at this point in the narrative where Robsjohn-Gibbings indirectly admits the failure of his organic campaign. Quote, post-war American householders seized on modernity. Houses became machines for living, end quote. However, a suggestion from Carlton to return to the old catalogues of drawings and recreate the pieces in Greece relights Robsjohn-Gibbings' fire. An assembly of 19 designs was researched, selected, and then marketed. The authorities ostensibly forbidding the use of any ancient sites for the stage-in provides a dramatic cliffhanger to the narrative. Finally, a Klismos chair is positioned next to the stele of Hegeso at the Keramakos, with a photographer from Life magazine on hand to capture it. A trip to the newly excavated Sanctuary of Artemis reveals a floor with holes for furniture. A Kleene couch, conveniently along for the ride, is tested and fits perfectly. The exhibition opens, the Greek royal family commends the efforts, and Greek furniture continued its journey through time. In conclusion, Robsjohn-Gibbings' writings did not achieve the design revolution he called for. However, his strident, if sanctimonious, convictions regarding egalitarianism and democracy expressed in design mean that his work must be considered in the context of his antecedents in the organic movement. Robsjohn-Gibbings didn't just resurrect Greek forms, he situated them in the philosophy he championed. While his polemical efforts may have come to naught, just as Eidlet's, Sullivan's, and Wright's did, also like his heroes, furnitures of classical Greece, and indeed Robsjohn-Gibbings' entire oeuvre, demonstrates a commitment to a design that revives, reinvents, and recontextualizes the classical past. Thank you very much.